Hello, dear African Root subscribers. Make yourself comfortable because today we dive into a story that will captivate you. Let's go!
What if everything you built with your own hands was quietly stolen from you by the one person who swore to protect you? What if the man standing in front of thousands, being celebrated as a visionary, owed every single word of his success to a woman the world never even knew existed? And what if that woman, invisible, erased, discarded, decided that today was the day she stopped being silent? If that sounds like something you need to hear, stay with me, because this story is going to hit you in a place you weren't expecting. Welcome to African Roots, and before we dive in, drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. I love knowing who's out there with me. Maya Caldwell had understood, long before most people do, that the most powerful presence in any room is rarely the loudest voice. She had come to understand it the hard way, sitting in the back of a rented conference hall in Atlanta 15 years ago, watching her then-boyfriend Darnell rehearse a speech she had written for him on a yellow legal pad at 2 in the morning. She'd been 26 years old, a communications graduate from Spelman College with a mind sharp enough to cut glass, and she'd watched him adjust his tie in the reflection of a framed poster and mouth her words like they were water he'd always had access to. The audience that evening had given Darnell a standing ovation. 3 board members had approached him afterward, handing him business cards with both hands. And not one person, not a single soul in that room, had looked toward the woman in the 3rd row in the gray dress, the one quietly gathering her legal pad back into her tote bag. She'd smiled to herself on the drive home, genuinely moved by what the words had done, what they had made people feel. She was young enough then to believe that impact was its own reward. Young enough to believe that a man who loved her would eventually make sure the world knew who she was. She told herself it didn't matter who got the credit. What mattered was that the words landed. What mattered was that they built something together. That was the story she told herself for 14 years. Darnell Caldwell was not a stupid man. That was the thing people always misunderstood about him. He was charming, perceptive, and carrying a confidence so immaculate it could make a room forget to ask questions. He had grown up in Decatur, Georgia, the youngest son of a pastor and a school administrator, and he carried himself with a particular polish of someone who had spent their entire childhood watching adults command attention. He knew how to walk into a room. He knew how to make people feel seen. What Darnell did not know, what he had never naturally possessed, was the ability to translate that charisma into language. Words on paper had always been a foreign country to him. Ideas came to him in flashes, impressions, instincts. But the architecture of a sentence, the rhythm of a paragraph, the specific gravity of a phrase that could make a boardroom go quiet, that was Maya. It had started innocently enough, the way most dangerous things do. Early in their marriage, she would help him prep for presentations. Then she started drafting them entirely. Then came the memos, the reports, the strategic briefs. When Darnell was offered his first executive VP role at Meridian Group, a mid-size investment and development firm based in Charlotte, Maya wrote his entire vision statement over a single weekend. She sat at the kitchen table in their Brookhaven home, their daughter Imani asleep upstairs, a glass of red wine going warm beside her laptop, and she built him a philosophy from scratch. He'd read it the next morning and said quietly, "This is exactly what I think. How do you always know what I'm thinking?" She'd smiled and poured his coffee and said nothing. That was the beginning of the arrangement neither of them ever named. Over the years, as Darnell climbed, VP to Senior VP to Chief Strategy Officer, and finally 3 years ago to President and CEO of Meridian Group, Maya's role expanded invisibly alongside him. She wrote his speeches. She crafted his op-eds that ran in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal under his name. She drafted the manifesto that won Meridian its most prestigious restructuring contract. She developed the internal culture documents that earned the company a spot on every best places to work list from 2019 to 2023. And through all of it, she was listed on the company website as Darnell Caldwell's wife. That was her title. That was her visibility. Not that Maya resented her family. She loved Imani with a fierce, bone-deep devotion. She had made a conscious choice to step back from her own career trajectory after the birth of their second child, Marcus. She didn't feel like a victim of her circumstances. Not then. What she felt for a long time was like a partner, an equal operating in the background, the engine behind the face. But something had shifted in Darnell in the years after his ascension to CEO. Power, Maya had come to understand, didn't just change people. It revealed them. And what it revealed in Darnell was a man who had quietly reclassified her in his mind. From partner to asset. From asset to fixture. From fixture to inconvenience. She noticed it first in small things. The way he stopped consulting her before major announcements. The way he'd come home late, distracted, and wave off her questions about how a board meeting had gone. The way he'd started referring to their household decisions as "my call," as though the house were a subsidiary and she were a department head who had been quietly restructured out of relevance. Then she found the emails. She hadn't been snooping. She genuinely hadn't been. She'd picked up his phone to silence an alarm, and a message had appeared on the screen from a contact saved as "itch," and the preview was enough. 3 lines were enough. "Last night was everything. Don't overthink the timing. You know this was always where we were headed." Maya had stood in their kitchen at 7:14 in the morning, the smell of French toast in the air, Imani finishing her homework at the counter, and felt something in her chest go very, very still. She thought about the last 5 years in a single compressed flash. All the evenings Darnell had come home smelling like a meeting that ran late. All the time she had asked how things were going at the office, and he had answered in the clipped, dismissive shorthand of a man who no longer considered her a peer. She thought about the fundraiser gala in September where she had stood at his side for 3 hours and been introduced, 4 times over, to 4 different people as simply Darnell's wife. And how each time she had extended her hand and smiled and said nothing, because that was what you did, that was the deal, that was who she had agreed to be. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She put the phone down and finished making breakfast. That stillness, cold, focused, precise, was something Maya had felt only once before in her life. The night before her thesis defense, when she'd realized her entire 3rd chapter needed restructuring and she'd had 6 hours to fix it. She'd felt that same eerie calm then. The feeling of a woman who has been tested before and survived, and knows that surviving requires clarity above all else. She spent 3 weeks doing nothing visible. But underneath she was doing everything. She pulled financial records. She documented her contributions, every speech, every article, every document she had authored. She had copies of everything, stored years ago in a private cloud account she'd never mentioned to Darnell, a quiet habit born not of suspicion but of professional pride. She had the original drafts, edit histories, the email threads where Darnell had forwarded her work to his assistant Simone Hargrove, as it she now understood, for formatting and distribution without a single acknowledgement of origin. Simone Hargrove was 29 years old, an MBA from Duke, and possessed of the particular ambition that recognizes an opening and moves through it without hesitation. Maya didn't blame her exactly. Simone had not made the vows. Simone had not built a life on a foundation of good faith. Maya reserved the full weight of her grief and her fury for the man who had. The situation came to a head on a Thursday evening in November, 2 weeks before Meridian Group's annual gala, the signature event where Darnell was set to deliver what the company was billing as his landmark Vision Decade speech. The speech that was supposed to cement his legacy. The speech that Maya had been writing, piece by piece, for the last 4 months. Darnell came home that Thursday and told her he wanted a divorce. He was calm about it. Practiced even. He sat across from her at the dining room table like he was presenting to a board. Composed, deliberate, emotionally managed. He said the marriage had run its course. He said they both deserved to be happy. He said he'd already spoken to a lawyer and he thought they could keep things civil for the children. Maya looked at him for a long moment. The man she had given her 20s and 30s and a significant portion of her intellectual life to. The man whose success she had authored in the most literal sense possible. "Okay," she said. "Just that, bae." Darnell blinked, clearly expecting something else. "Tears maybe. An argument." She gave him nothing. She excused herself, went upstairs, and called her best friend Kezia Mitchell, a family law attorney who had been telling Maya for 2 years that she needed to protect herself. "He's moving," Maya said when Kezia picked up. "I know," Kezia said. "So are we." The night of Meridian Group's annual gala fell on a crisp Saturday in early December. The venue was the Grand Ballroom of the Westin in Uptown Charlotte. 1,200 guests, board members, investors, media, community leaders. The kind of room where legacies are made and dismantled. Darnell arrived with Simone on his arm, which sent a precise, calculated shockwave through the crowd. Maya had been expected to attend. Her name was still in the program as a co-host. Instead, it was Simone in a midnight blue gown. Her hand resting at Darnell's elbow like she'd been rehearsing for this moment for years. What no one in that ballroom knew was that 40 minutes before the event began, Darnell had received a certified letter at the venue's reception desk. Inside was a 17-page document prepared by Kezia Mitchell's firm. It was a comprehensive record of Maya's intellectual contributions to Meridian's public-facing work over 14 years, with dates, original drafts, edit chains, and a legal assessment of authorship and credit. Attached was a formal notice of intent to file for equitable compensation and public attribution as part of the divorce proceedings. At the bottom, in Maya's handwriting on a personal note card, were 7 words. "You'll want to read this before you take that stage." And below them just her initial, M. Darnell had read it. Kezia had made sure someone photographed him reading it. His expression cracking just slightly, the mask slipping for the span of 3 seconds before he composed himself and handed the envelope to his security detail. Inside the ballroom, the evening proceeded. Cocktails, introductions, the usual theater of corporate celebration. Board members shook hands. Investors smiled for cameras. And then, 40 minutes into the program, the MC introduced the president and CEO of Meridian Group for his landmark address. Darnell walked to the podium to applause. He was, as always, immaculate. Navy suit, pocket square, the practiced warmth of a man built for stages. He arranged his notes, Maya's notes, and looked out at the crowd with the confidence of someone who believed the ground beneath him was solid. The room leaned in. The room always leaned in when Darnell spoke. That was the one thing that had always been genuinely, authentically his. The physical presence, the gravity, the way every corner of the space seemed to converge on him. And for a fleeting moment, watching through a live stream on her phone from her sister's apartment 20 minutes away, Maya felt the old pull of it. The old pride. The strange bittersweet ache of having loved someone who was, in certain specific ways, genuinely extraordinary, even as he failed her in the ways that mattered most. He began to speak. And then, 3 paragraphs in, he faltered. It was small enough that most of the room didn't catch it. Was a glance down at the page. A sentence that lost its rhythm mid-flight. But the board members in the front row, men and women who had watched Darnell perform for years, felt it. The speech that usually flowed like a river was catching on rocks. Because Darnell Caldwell, without Maya's hand behind the words, had never fully understood the architecture of what he was saying. He could deliver them. He could not inhabit them. And tonight, for the first time, the gap between delivery and understanding was visible to anyone paying close attention. He recovered. He finished. The applause was generous, if slightly cooled. But the damage was done in the way that truly important damage always is. Not loudly but precisely in the minds of the people who mattered. 3 days later, a story appeared in the Charlotte Observer's business section. The headline read, "The woman behind Meridian's words. A divorce exposes the hidden architect of a CEO's rise." Kezia had not leaked it. She hadn't needed to. The certified letter had made its way to a board member's spouse, who happened to be a journalist. The story was careful and thoroughly sourced. It detailed Maya's contributions. It included quotes from 2 former Meridian employees who confirmed that documents attributed to Darnell had been authored, in full, by his wife. It included one comment from Maya, given through her attorney, that said only, "I spent 14 years building something I believed in. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for the record to be accurate." The story went national by noon. Maya was not watching the news cycle when it exploded. She was at a coffee shop in the South End neighborhood of Charlotte, sitting across from the Dean of Communications at Johnson C. Smith University, who had reached out to her 6 months earlier about a visiting faculty position she had quietly declined. She hadn't declined this time. She was wearing a camel-colored blazer she'd bought 3 years ago and never had occasion to wear, and her natural hair was out, full, crown-like, unapologetic. She had a notebook open and a coffee at her elbow, and she was talking about a curriculum for a graduate seminar on strategic narrative and organizational communication. She was, for the first time in years, building something in her own name. Meridian Group's board announced a governance review within 2 weeks of the story breaking. Darnell remained as CEO, at least for now. Institutions move slowly, and power protects power. But the landscape had shifted. 3 board members issued statements affirming their commitment to attribution and workplace integrity. 2 major institutional investors requested meetings. The story had struck a nerve that corporate culture cannot easily dismiss. Documented evidence presented with the quiet, dignified precision of a woman who did not need to yell to be heard. Maya's divorce was finalized 5 months later. The settlement included equitable compensation for her intellectual contributions to Meridian's public record. It was not a number she shared publicly. It was a number that allowed her to breathe, to stabilize, to look at the next decade of her life without the weight of someone else's ambition pressing down on her spine. Imani, 17 and sharper than both her parents, asked Maya one evening during that difficult stretch, "Mom, do you regret it? Any of it?" Maya thought about it for a real moment. Not the polished, performative thinking of someone with a practiced answer, but genuine consideration. "I regret not knowing my own value sooner," she said finally. "I don't regret the work. The work was real, was good. I just gave it away without keeping a copy of the receipt." Imani laughed at that. And then Maya laughed too. And in that small, ordinary kitchen moment something eased. Here is what this story asks us to sit with. There are forms of erasure that don't look like violence. They look like love. They look like partnership. They look like someone saying that you're the genius behind all of this, while their hand is slowly covering your name. And the most dangerous part of that kind of erasure is that it moves slowly enough that it can be mistaken for choice. Maya Caldwell did not lose years. She invested them. The difference between those two things is whether the record eventually gets corrected. Whether a person at some point stands in their own name and says, "This was mine, this is who I am, and I am not asking for permission to be seen." Dignity is not something that can be permanently taken from you. It can be hidden, suppressed, buried under a decade of someone else's applause. But it does not disappear. Wait. And when the moment comes, when you are finally ready to stop protecting someone who stopped protecting you, it rises. Not with noise. With documentation. With clarity. With a note card and 17 pages of evidence, and a camel blazer and a Tuesday morning meeting that changes everything. That is the kind of woman who wins. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, anger, recognition, relief, or hope, drop a like and subscribe to African Roots so you never miss an episode. Hit that bell icon so the next story finds you the moment it drops. And tell me in the comments, what do you think Maya should have done differently, if anything? Or was every single step exactly right? I read every single one of your messages, and I mean that. The next episode is coming sooner than you think. And trust me, you will not see what's coming. Thank you for being here. You make these stories worth telling.
And that is for today. I hope you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and activate the bell so you don't miss any video. See you very soon on African Roots. See you soon.